Now we're going to go ahead and create a dashboard based on the data worksheet that we just created. Now to create a dashboard, we're going to use the Visual Composer tool. That is our web-based tool for dashboard creation. And so we'll need to start the iNetSoft server in order to use that tool. So go ahead to the Windows Start menu. You can leave Style Studio running in the background if you wish. Go ahead to the Windows Start menu, and from the Style Intelligence installation folder, select the Style Intelligence server. When that loads up, you should see a page that looks like this. And this page has 3 links on it: Enterprise Manager, User Portal, and Documentation. Enterprise Manager is the administration tool for the Style Intelligence server. User Portal is the user portal where users will view reports and dashboards, and where we'll be going in just a moment to design our dashboard. And the documentation link helps you find additional documentation that covers the material that we've been discussing in this video. For example, you can find the evaluation guide in this documentation, as well as all of the other topics that relate to Style Intelligence, including administration and reports and integration and so on. Now, our purpose here right now is to create a new dashboard based on the data worksheet that we just created. So let's go ahead and do that. Click the User Portal link. That takes us to the User Portal. The User Portal, as you can see, has 4 main tabs at the top, although in your own installation, you may see fewer tabs depending on how the administrator has chosen to set it up. But at least in our evaluation version, we have the standard 4 tabs: Dashboard, which gives you quick access to dashboards; Report, which gives you access to the full repository listing; Design, which we'll be using in a second to design our dashboard; and Schedule, which allows you to schedule reports and dashboards for automatic generation. So since we're designing a dashboard, let's go to the Design tab, and let's click on Visual Composer. This opens a separate window. Visual Composer is a separate browser window. Note that this does not require you to install any software on your own machine. This is purely a browser-based tool, although it does require that your browser have Flash installed. So if you see any kind of error related to Flash or Shockwave, probably what that means is that you need to update your browser to the latest Flash plugin. Okay, so now we've got Visual Composer open, and we can begin designing our dashboard. Now you'll notice that at the top there are 2 buttons. There's a New Worksheet button and a New View Sheet button. A worksheet is exactly the same data worksheet that we've already have experience with from Style Studio. In fact, you can create data worksheets in Visual Composer purely through the browser, just like you can create data worksheets in Style Studio. So if you were to press the New Worksheet button, you would see a blank worksheet, just like the blank worksheet that we previously opened in Style Studio. So you do have 2 avenues for creating worksheets, both in Visual Composer and in Style Studio. In general, if you're working in Style Studio, for example, if you're a report designer or a query designer, then it's probably easiest to use Style Studio to create worksheets. If you're a dashboard designer, in other words, you're usually working in Visual Composer and you find that you need to create a data worksheet, then it might be easiest to use Visual Composer for that purpose. In both cases, when you save a data worksheet, it's saved in that file that I mentioned before called asset.dat, and all of the features that you have for creating data worksheets in Style Studio, you will also find when you create data worksheets in Visual Composer. But our purpose here is not to create a worksheet, so I'm going to close this. Our purpose is to create a dashboard, and for that we're going to use this button here, New View Sheet. A view sheet is our own term for a dashboard, so in the course of this training, you may hear me use the term view sheet and dashboard interchangeably. When I say that we're creating a new view sheet, I mean that we're creating a new dashboard, and vice versa. So press the New View Sheet button to create a new dashboard, and the first prompt that you'll see is a prompt to select a data source. Right? So a dashboard, as you know, is a mechanism for the user to interact with data. And so obviously a dashboard has to be getting its data from somewhere, and that's what we're specifying here. Where does the data come from that will populate the dashboard? And in this case, we want our data to come from the data worksheet that we created not too long ago. So expand the global worksheet node on the tree, and then let's find the worksheet that we created. The worksheet that we just finished creating is the order data worksheet. And you'll notice that there's also the Excel order data worksheet. Remember that we had created also an Excel-based data worksheet where we imported data from an Excel file into the worksheet. All right, so we actually have a choice of two data sources we could use here, either the data worksheet that we created from the Excel data or the order data worksheet that we saved just a few moments ago. And let's select this latest one. So this is the worksheet that we created, which is based on the formal data source that we also created at the beginning of this video. So select that. And now what you see here is a blank dashboard. It looks very much like a data worksheet, but we'll see very shortly that it behaves completely differently. But at least for now, you see the same kind of grid. In the left panel, you'll see a toolbox that contains a list of components that we can use to create this dashboard. And at the very top, you'll see the data source that the dashboard is based on. So there's the order data worksheet. And if we expand that, you'll see all of the data blocks that were present in the worksheet that we previously created. Here are the four base tables that we brought in from our data source, the database tables. And then at the top, the data block that we marked as the primary data block, called order data, is listed, and we can expand that to see the fields in there. And you'll notice that all of the fields that we had chosen not to hide are displayed there along with the expression field that we created. So now we have our data, and we can begin building this dashboard. Let's begin by creating a table based on the order data block that we have from the worksheet. Now I'm going to make a little bit more space for myself by shrinking the left panel, giving me a little bit more room on the dashboard itself. Now, in general, to create a table on the dashboard, what you can do is you can find the table component. This is one of the data view components. So in the data view folder of the toolbox, you can find a table component and simply click and drag that table component into the dashboard to create a blank table. And then into that table, you can drop whatever fields you want. So for example, if I want the company field from our order data block, I can drag that in there, and I can add any other fields that I want simply by dragging and looking for the green highlight to tell me where that field will be placed. I could place it to the left, I could place it to the right of an existing field, I could substitute the new field for the existing field, and so on. So this is the general way that you can build up a table from individual fields. Now in this particular case, I want to create a table based on all of the fields from the order data block. And so I could do it this way. I can, one by one drag all the fields into this table component, but I have an easier way. So I'm going to delete this, just drag across it or click on the table to select it, and then press the delete key on the keyboard to delete it, or right click and select remove. And let's do this an easier way, and that is simply to drag the entire data block. So if I want to create a table in the dashboard that will give me all of the fields from this order data block, I'm just going to drag the entire data block, just click and drag into the dashboard, and that will give me the entire table. So that's the quicker way to create a table when you want all of the fields from a particular data block. Okay, let's expand. We know that there are many rows here because we know that the order data block has about 4,000 rows. So we're not even going to make an attempt to show all of the rows, but we can make this a little bit taller. And you do that again just by dragging the bottom border, similar to the way we resized a table in the worksheet previously. You just drag any border to expand the size of the component. So we've given it a little bit more space here. Okay, let's also set a style for this table. A style is basically a global format, so it specifies in one shot that there should be particular formatting, such as backgrounds, fonts, etc. In fact, this table already has a style. If you look at it, it has a default style. It's basically alternating gray and white rows, and the column headers are in bold. So there is already a style here, but let's illustrate how we can select a different style. So right-click on the table and select Properties from the right-click context menu. Every component in the dashboard has a Properties dialog box similar to this one. The properties will vary, of course, depending on the component, but in general, there's a set of tabs at the top. All components have a general tab, and then the other tabs may vary depending on the particular component. In this case, one of the main properties that a table has is the table style, and you find it right on the General tab. And so in this case, let's select a particular table style from the blue folder. Let's find dark header clean bands. So the one we want here is dark header clean bands. It has a dark header, obviously, and clean band style, no borders. Yeah, so that's the style we want for our table. So press OK, and that style is applied to the table. Now, the fact that we used a global table style doesn't mean that we can't do additional formatting, ad hoc formatting. We certainly can, and we will. For example, changing fonts and changing alignments and things like that. But when you can use a table style, it's often handy to do so because a good table style can, in one fell swoop, style the entire table. In this case, we're going to do some additional work. But first, let's make the table a little bit wider. And to do that, I'm going to drag the right boundary of the table. This is the same way I expanded the bottom previously. I'm going to click and drag on the right boundary to make it one column wider. One thing you'll note about tables is that the outer boundary of the table always aligns with the grid. So I can move this, I can move the right boundary of the table to here, or I can move it to here, but I cannot move it in between. However, one thing that you can do, if you do need to get the boundary of a table somewhere in between the grid lines, you can actually resize the grid itself. So the grid itself, if you go up to the column headers or the row headers of the grid, you'll note that you can actually change the size of the grid, and so that is often helpful in getting components exactly where you want them to be. In this case, I'm going to put the grid back like it was. And what I instead want to do is I want to try to make sure that all of the values displayed in the table can be visible. Right? So you'll notice that some of the company values are being cropped off by the state column. And so what I can do to make that happen is just change the spacing of the columns within the table. And when I do this, I have complete freedom. So, for example, I'll click on the right boundary of the column, of the company column, and I can simply drag that to give the companies a little bit more space. Let's see, I can probably also give the products a little bit more space. Just have to try to find the boundaries. The total field does not need to be that wide, so I can use the total field to give me a bit more space. So I'm just adjusting the column spacing, and again, within the table, the columns are not bound to the grid, so you can readjust these however you like. Okay, the order date column, I'm not going to worry about too much right now because we're going to change the formatting there. So again, just want to make sure that at least the company names are fully visible, and we can tinker with the distribution here a little bit more later once we apply some additional formatting. Okay, let's center the headers. So to do that, I'm going to select the leftmost header just by clicking on it, the company header, and then shift-click on the total header. That selects all of the headers. And what I want to do is simply center align the headers. The easiest way to do that is by using the toolbar buttons up at the top. Many of the basic functions for formatting you'll find in the toolbar here. In this case, I want to center the headers, so just having selected all of the headers, simply click the center button, and that will center all of the headers. The next thing we want to do is apply some formatting. For example, the total column here, we'd like to display as a currency. And there are two ways to do this. Again, the easiest way to do it is to use the toolbar button. So we'll illustrate that in a moment. So you select any value in the total column and just press the currency button in the toolbar, and that will apply a currency format to the total. And again, we can, as we change these formats, we can reshuffle slightly the column spacing to make sure that things look nice. The other way to do this is to right-click on any of the values in the total column and select Format. And that opens the Format dialog box, and this gives you more extensive control than you'll find from the toolbar. So if you can't find a function in the toolbar to implement the formatting that you want, then what you would do is open the Format dialog box, and in here you can set other formats, and you can also change font, color, border, etc. And so this is the other way we could have done this, by selecting the currency format here. But typically, using the toolbar is easier. So we've styled the total field with a currency format. Let's do the same for the price field. And again, just click on any cell in the price field, and then press the currency format in the toolbar to apply a currency format to that particular field. And you can see that it formats all the values in that field. Let's continue on to the order date field, and here we'd like to format this date field in a particular way. Now here we're not going to find a button in the toolbar to give us exactly the format we want, so in this case we will use the Format dialog box to get the format. So right-click on any of the dates in the order date column, and select Format from the right-click menu, and then select the date format. When you select the date format, you can choose from a bunch of preset date formats. These use the special date and time syntax that we've seen previously in other videos that allows us to use these symbols to construct our own date format. In this case, we're going to construct the following custom format: capital M, slash lowercase d, slash lowercase y. And what this format means is I want the 2-digit month, 2-digit day, 4-digit year separated by slashes. For more information about these date formats, please consult the documentation. We're not going to go into it in detail here, but hopefully you get the idea of how these codes represent the different components of a date. So there's our date format. We can press OK, and now the dates are formatted as we specified, with a 2-digit month, 2-digit day, and 4-digit year. The next thing we'd like to do is center some of the data, center align some of the data. For example, the states here, we can center align under the state column. So select any value in the state column and then press the center button. And let's do the same for a couple of the other fields. The date field, so select any value in the date column and press the center button in the toolbar. And then also for the quantity field, select any value in the quantity field, quantity column, and press the center button in the toolbar. Let's right align the currency columns, so that's the total column. Select any value in the total column and press the right align button, and then select any value in the price column and press the right align button. Okay, now let's just rearrange the columns slightly. So we have here company, state, and then order date. And what I want next is the product name. So how do I move a column in the table? Well, you can simply click on the column header and drag the column where you want it to go. So I'm going to click on the product column header and then just drag it to the left right over here. And I look for the green highlight to tell me where the column is going to be placed. So when I see the green highlight between the order date field and the quantity field, I can let it go there, and the product will be placed between those two fields. So now I have product, quantity, price, and total, and that's the order that I want. Let's go ahead and just double check the width of the columns to make sure that everything looks fine. The state field looks fine. Product looks okay. The price column is a little bit cramped, and I think I can, at the expense of the quantity column, I think I can probably give that a little bit more room. It's possible that I might have sorted the quantity column. I noticed that there is a sort indicator here. If that happened to you while you were resizing the columns, then simply press that button again to turn off the sort. In general, if you want to do a single column sort, that is the approach that you would take to get an alphabetical or reverse alphabetical sort. Just click on the button in the column header, sort alphabetical, sort reverse alphabetical, and so on. Click it a third time and it removes the sort. So if you also had accidentally sorted one of the columns, you can simply remove the sort that way. Let's go ahead and save the dashboard. We now have a dashboard with a table. This is just the beginning of this dashboard, but it's good to save often, so press the Save button, and we'll save this dashboard as Order Data Dashboard. Order Data Dashboard. We'll save this under Global View Sheets. And as was the case with data worksheets, when you save a dashboard, the dashboard gets saved together with other dashboards and other worksheets in that file that I mentioned before, asset.dat. So let's save this at the root level, at the global view sheet level, press OK, and now the dashboard is saved. And when we want to reopen the dashboard after it's closed, for example, if we close this tab by pressing the red X at the bottom, now we've closed this dashboard. To reopen the dashboard, we'll look for it under the global view sheet node here, and that's where we'll find the order data dashboard that we just saved. And to reopen it, you can just double click, and that will take us back to where we were. And we can now move on to add other components to this dashboard. Now, the heart of a dashboard is its selection components. That is the filtering components that allow you to decide what data you want to see and what data you want to omit. For example, you might want to see in this table only data from the state of New Jersey, or you might want to see only data from the year 2011, or perhaps you might want to see only sales where the total was greater than $200,000. Right? So any of these kinds of different views of the data are achieved by means of selection components. So let's go ahead and add some selection components. We'll add a selection component for company so that the user of the dashboard can select what set of companies they want to see. And again, there are two ways to do this. The first way is to add an empty selection component. So from the selection folder, you could find a selection list component, drag that into the dashboard. That would give you a blank selection list. And then into the selection list, you would drop the field that you want the user to be able to filter. For example, you could grab the company field, drag that into the selection list, and then the user would be able to select different companies. So that is one approach to adding a selection list. And if you do it that way, you can go ahead and test it out and verify that when you make selections in the selection list, that in fact the table will be filtered to display just those selections. So the selection list is in fact a filter that operates on the table in this case because that's all we have. But when we add a chart and a gauge and other elements to this dashboard, the filters that we add will operate on those components as well. So that's one way to add a selection list. Let's take a look at the other way. I just deleted that by pressing the delete key on the keyboard. The other way to add a selection list is much simpler, and that is you simply find the field that you want the user to be able to filter, again, in this case, the company field, and just drag that field into an empty region of the dashboard. And that will give you a selection list. So that's the quick and easy way to add a selection list. And you can resize this. We'll make this 2 columns wide. I made it 3 columns, but I intended to make it 2 columns. So 2 columns wide. So now the user will be able to filter different companies as we indicated before simply by making selections. To clear the selections, you can press the eraser button, the clear selection button at the top right. One of the other videos on using a dashboard explains how to operate these selection lists and what the different symbols here mean. We're not going to go into that in detail now. Rather, we're going to focus on building this dashboard. So let's go ahead and add another selection list. This time we're going to add a selection list for state. So just like we did for the company selection list, grab the state field and drag that in down below the company selection list. And here again, we can make this 2 columns wide by dragging the border. You can move the entire selection list, as for any component, simply by dragging the title bar or by dragging the move handle. Okay, so there's a move handle here, and you can click and drag on that to move the component. Now for the state selection list, you'll notice that there's seems to be a waste of space here. These are all 2-letter abbreviations. They don't take up much space, and yet we have this whole other column here. It would be nice if we could get 2 columns of states, and that way the user would be able to, at a glance, see many more states. And in fact, you can do that. To do it, click on any of the state cells. Doesn't matter which one. And then you'll notice that over at the right side, there's a small handle at the right side of that cell. And you can click and drag on that handle to the left, and that will allow you to double up the states. So you get 2 columns of states. Now, sometimes when you're accessing that handle, especially if it's in a column that's right next to the scroll bar, the scroll bar might interfere with your ability to get at that handle. So what you do is you select the cell, then move the mouse over the handle and wait for the scroll bar to disappear, then you can grab the handle. Okay, so we have 2 columns of states, and now we'd like to add one more filter. In this case, we'd like the user to be able to filter also on the order date. Now, in this case, we don't want a selection list, right? We don't want to provide the user with a list of individual dates, let's say 5,000 individual dates to select from. Rather, we want the user to be able to select the date range on a slider. And again, there are 2 ways to do that. There's a component called a range slider, and you can find that from the selection folder. So you can find a range slider component and add a blank range slider to the dashboard simply by clicking and dragging. And then onto that range slider, you can drag any date field or numeric field. In our case, we could drag the order date field onto that range slider, and then this range slider would filter the order dates, and you could test it out. You can drag the left handle and keep your eye on the dates here. So now I've selected date in 2011. Let me move it a little bit more into the future, into 2012. So now all of the dates that I see in this column should be between November 2012 and December 2013. And at a quick glance, it seems that that is the case. I'm seeing dates from 2012 and 2013. It would be easier to see this if we sort the column, but I'm not going to do that right now because I want to show you the other way to add a range slider. So one way, again, is to add a blank range slider component and then drag any date field or numerical field, such as quantity, onto the range slider. I'll delete that. The other way is simpler. The other way is you take a date field or you take a numerical field, but in this case we're using the order date field, and just drag that into an empty region of the dashboard. And that will give you automatically a range slider that filters that date field. And so we can move this guy down here near the bottom of the table. So there's our range slider for dates. And again, you can verify the operation if we put a sort on the date field so that it's sorted from earliest dates to latest dates, and then drag the handle of the range slider. You'll notice that the range slider is in fact controlling the dates that are displayed in the date field. You can drag either handle, the start date or the end date, and you can also click and drag on the body of the range slider to slide the entire date range. If you double click on the slider, it expands the slider to again select the full range, and I'll just remove the sort from the date column. Okay, we can reposition some of these just by dragging them, and I'll make the company selection list a little bit taller. And now we have our basic selection components, And feel free to try them out. Select different companies, and you'll notice that the data in the table updates so that only the selected companies are displayed. And you can also try selecting different states. For example, I've selected 3 companies, AMG Logistics, Computer Tech, and Daycare One. The state selection list updates to indicate that the data being returned in the result set contains data from 3 states. In other words, these 3 companies exist in 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. If I want to see only New Jersey, then I can select New Jersey, and now all of the data is just from Daycare One, that one company, from the state of New Jersey. So experiment with the different selection lists. You'll notice that they do interact with each other. So when you make selections in one selection list, that might modify selections in the other selection list. Again, the video on using a dashboard covers that type of interaction. So if you want to learn more about how to use these different selection lists and why one selection list might change another selection list, please watch the video on using a dashboard. But for now, I'm going to clear these selection lists. Press the clear selection button here, press the clear selection button here, and now we're looking at all of the data, but we now have the ability for the end user to filter the data on company, on state, and on date range. The next thing that we'll do is add a gauge to display the aggregated total. In other words, the sum total for whatever set of records are currently selected in the result set. To add a new gauge, find the gauge component. You'll find it in the output folder. So here's the gauge component, and you can click and drag that component above the selection lists. To move the gauge, you can click and drag on the move handle, or you can click and drag on the face of the gauge, or you can also press the arrow keys on the keyboard to move it incrementally on the grid. You can hold down the control key to move it in smaller increments while you press the arrow keys on the keyboard. So position the gauge as you'd like it. Later on, we will probably have to reposition several components to get the final spacing on the dashboard, so it's not really necessary to spend too much time positioning things perfectly now. So let's go ahead and configure the gauge so that it displays the aggregated total. To do that, we're going to find the total field in the data source. That's the order data block. Find the total field and simply drag that field onto the gauge. When you see the green highlight around the gauge, that means that it's okay to drop the field, and you can drop the field on the gauge, and now this gauge is displaying the aggregated total value. So in other words, for whatever set of data I select, in other words, if I select, let's say, just data from the company Computer Tech, sales to the company Computer Tech, so that now in this result set displayed in the table, I'm seeing only data from the company Computer Tech. Now the gauge is going to display the aggregated total for that particular company. Now you can see that the gauge itself has numbering in terms of thousands. That's indicated by the K at the bottom. So where you see currently 600, that's 600,000. And that's reasonable for this data set, because if we clear the selections and look at all the data, then you'll notice that these numbers are quite large. So the sum total for all of the records gets up to a very large number. So we don't want to write out that full number, and representing it in terms of thousands is reasonable. However, if you did want to change that representation, even if you wanted to keep it as thousands but introduce, for example, some commas to make the values easier to read, what you would do is right-click on the gauge, and let me see if I can get that menu more on the screen there. Right-click on the gauge and select Format. That opens the Format dialog box for the gauge. This dialog box is not only available for gauges, it's also available, as we saw previously, for table columns and for text elements and for other elements as well, whenever you need to set the format. Again, for example, for range sliders, if you need to set the date format, you always have this Format dialog box available. And so what we can do is we can explicitly set the format by selecting a number format. instead of the none format. Select the number format, and then we can explicitly enter a format either by selecting one of the presets or by typing our own. What I'll do in this case is select this format that also represents the data in terms of thousands, again indicated by the K at the end, but this format has a comma every 3 digits, so I think that will make the numbers a little bit easier to read. So we have hash, comma, hash, 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 and then capital K, meaning that the number, the actual value will be divided by 1,000 before being displayed. So we've set a custom format. You can press OK, and you can see that the numbering really hasn't changed much because we're still representing in terms of thousands, but now we have a comma. And if you make some selections, you'll notice that the comma is only displayed when we have more than 3 digits in the number. Okay, let's make another change to the gauge. What we'll find is that you can actually select different gauge faces. Let's do this by right-clicking on the gauge again, and this time select Properties. That opens the Properties dialog box for the gauge. And among other settings, such as increment and minimum and maximum, you'll see down at the bottom you have the opportunity to select different gauge faces. So feel free to select a gauge that whose style appeals to you. I'm going to select this one here. This is a kind of a colorful blue gauge with an embedded text element, or rather an embedded digital display. So that can be helpful because it will display the number numerically, and that will aid users in getting a more accurate reading of the value displayed by the gauge. So, but if you see one that appeals to you more, then you can select that one as well, and then press OK. And that will change the gauge style. You can make the gauge a bit larger than this. Currently, the values are so small they're hard to read. So I'm going to resize the gauge so that the gauge face itself gets about 2 columns of width. So something like this. So the gauge should be able to take up a full 2 columns. And you can see that we get now not only the analog reading provided by the gauge, but also in the little window at the bottom, a digital reading, giving us a more precise numerical figure. Okay, let's go ahead now and add an input component. An input component, as distinguished from a selection component, an input component is a tool that provides a way for a user to modify properties of the dashboard. So these selection components are filters. They provide a way for the user to filter the data, whereas an input component, such as the one we're about to add, allows a user to modify properties of the dashboard. And those properties can be, for example, the fields that are plotted on a chart, or the method of aggregation that's used in a chart, or the method of aggregation that's used in a gauge, and so on. So we'll see in a few minutes how to use an input component to control the display of a chart. But before we do that, let's first add the input component. So we'll find an input component in the input folder and scroll down to find the input folder, and then select and click and drag on the radio button control. So just drag that into an empty region of the dashboard, and that gives us a blank radio button. Now, what we're going to use this for is we're going to give the user the ability to choose for a chart that we're going to add later, whether the chart displays the measure total, so we have a total measure, or whether the chart displays the measure quantity. So this is going to be a choice that the end user can make, rather than having 2 charts, one that displays total and one that displays quantity. We'll have a single chart, and the user will use the radio button to choose between total and quantity being displayed on the chart. So whenever you want to populate an input component with field names, as we do here, we want a choice of either quantity or total. The easiest way to do that is simply to drag the field names into the input component. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drag the quantity field from the data source right onto the radio button, right onto the input component, and drop it there when you see the green highlight. So now this radio button has one choice that gives us quantity. Of course, that would not be a very useful radio button with only a single choice. So let's go ahead and add also the total field. We'll drag that also onto the radio button, and that now adds total as a second choice. Let's make a couple of changes to the radio button. What we can do is we can stack the two labels one on top of the other rather than side by side. So what I can do is drag down the bottom border of the radio button and then just make it a little bit narrower so that it's one column in width. And now the two labels are one on top of the other. And we can also change the title of the radio button as well as the name of the radio button. So right-click on the radio button and select Properties. That opens the Properties dialog box for the radio button. Now let's change the name, which is the very top property, to Measure Choice. So the name of the component is essentially the ID of the component. So we're giving this radio button control an ID called Measure Choice. Now the reason that we're doing this is that in a few minutes when we create the chart that the radio button will control, remember that this radio button is intended to allow the user to control the measure that's displayed on the chart. When we create that chart, we're going to need to refer to this radio button control by its name, by this ID. So it's useful to give it a meaningful name rather than leave the name as radio button 1 or radio button 2. That will certainly lead to confusion. So if you give the radio button a meaningful name, and this is true for all input components, give it a meaningful name, it will make things easier later on when you need to be able to distinguish the different input components. So the name, again, is essentially the ID. And we can also give the radio button a title. The title is simply the text that appears in the header in the title bar of the radio button. So let's call this simply Choose. In other words, this is going to be an instruction to the user to choose a particular measure. Now, if you want to change the values that appear in the radio button control, you can do that from the List Values panel here. Currently, we're using an embedded list, which means that the list of items, the list of radio button values, is supplied manually as a list. Recall that we currently have populated the radio button by dragging in field names from our data source. But if you want to make any modifications to that, you can press the Edit button next to the Embedded option. And there you'll see the two fields that we added to the radio button by dragging them onto the radio button. Quantity and total were the two fields. And what you can do here is you can change the labels or you can change the values. The labels are simply represent the text that appears on the radio button control. So you can change the labels to whatever you'd like, and that has no effect on the operation of the radio button. That simply modifies what text is displayed to the user in the interface. The value is the actual value that is submitted when the user makes a choice from that input control. So when the user selects the quantity label, the string, in this case quantity, is actually submitted as the choice. So in general, you should be very careful when you change the values because the functionality of the control depends on the values that are submitted when the user makes a selection. In this case, the submitted values must exactly match the field names because the radio button is being used to select a particular field to place on the chart ultimately. So the value that is submitted has to match a legitimate field name. The labels are arbitrary. The labels can be whatever you'd like them to be. And by using this interface, you can add additional values. In this particular example, because this radio button is being used to select field names, the easiest way to add additional values is the way that we did it previously, which is simply to drag the field names onto the radio button. But you can also do that by pressing the Add button and by adding additional values and labels here. Okay, let's cancel this. In this case, we don't need to make any additions. We're satisfied with the two fields that we're already populating the radio button with. So we can cancel that. And I'll just point out that you can also populate a radio button or other input control from a query. So you can select a data block by selecting Query here and pressing Edit. You can select a data block to supply the values that should be used as the labels and the values for the radio button or other input control. So in the event that you have a table in your data worksheet in the underlying data source, and you want to use the values in that table to populate the radio button or other input control, you can do that as well. But again, in this case, we don't need to do that, so I'm going to deselect that option. Okay, let's press OK to close the Properties dialog box. And you can see there's the title, just says Choose. And now this radio button has a name as well, an ID, called Measure Choice. And so now we're done with this radio button for now. So let's move it to the side. I'm going to simply drag the radio button up here into an empty space above the gauge. This is not where we intend it to go ultimately, but since we need to add a chart in this space over here above the table, I want to move the radio button out of the way, and then later on we'll put the radio button into essentially on top of the chart in an empty region so that we can economize space on the dashboard. Okay, let's go ahead and then begin creating this chart. This chart is going to have on the y-axis, as we mentioned, either the quantity or the total. That will be the user's choice. And on the x-axis, it will have the order dates grouped by quarter. So to begin adding a chart, first find the chart component in the Data View folder and drag a blank chart into the dashboard. We can resize the chart to be as wide as the table. Something about this size should be adequate, perhaps a bit taller to align with the top of the gauge. And we can certainly readjust any of these things later on as we move into the final phase of making sure that the dashboard layout is appropriate. But for right now, we just need to set up the chart. On the x-axis, we're going to want to place the order date field. So expand the data source node, the order data block. And when you're setting up a chart, you'll notice that the fields are divided into dimensions and measures. And that's based on the data type. So fields that contain string type data are considered dimensions, or date type data are considered dimensions, and numerical fields are considered measures. If for some reason when you're doing this, you find that a field which ought to be a measure has been treated as a dimension, or vice versa, you can always change that by right-clicking on the field and selecting for a dimension, convert to measure, or for a measure, convert to dimension. But for us, in this example, everything here looks good. So what we want to do in order to place the dates on the x-axis is click and drag on the order date field, and drag that down to the X region in the data panel. Okay, so now we have the order date field on the x-axis of the chart. I'm going to expand the chart editor just a bit to make sure that there's enough room here, and I'll scroll the dashboard so that we can keep that in view. So we have the order date field on the x-axis, but you'll notice that by default the grouping of the dates is by year. So we have only 4 labels on the x-axis, one for each of the 4 years in the data set. What we want to do is see this broken out by quarter. So to do that, click the Edit Dimension button, that's the little calculator button, next to the order date field on the x-axis. And in there, there's a level property, and we can simply set that level to quarter. So now the dates will be grouped by quarter. Press the Apply button, which is the green triangle button. And now on the x-axis of the chart, you'll see the dates have been grouped by quarter. Let's go ahead and now add a measure to the y-axis. As I mentioned before, ultimately, the user will choose what measure to display on the y-axis, but we have to initially put some measure on the y-axis. So I'm going to choose the quantity measure. Just click and drag on the quantity field and drag that down to the y-axis in the chart editor. And you can see now that the y-axis of the chart is displaying the summed quantities for each quarter. Okay, let's change this chart into a stacked bar chart. Currently it's a line chart. We want to change it to a stacked bar chart. So to do that, press the Select Chart Style button. That's in the title bar of the data panel, Select Chart Style. And from there, select a bar type chart. That's the in the top row, the second chart from the left is a bar chart, and then select the stack option down at the bottom. And that selects now a stack bar type chart. Press apply, and that gives us a bar chart. Now, because we don't have any additional categorization or grouping on the chart, it's not clear what the stacking is yet. It's still just a chart of quantity versus quarter. But in just a moment, what we're going to do is we're going to add the state field as another grouping field, and we're going to use color to distinguish the different states. And then the stacking will become apparent. So let's do that. Find the state field in the dimension folder, and drag the state field all the way down to the color region in the visual panel at the bottom of the editor. When you add a field to the color panel or to any of the other regions in the visual panel, what that will do is distinguish the different groups in that field by using the associated attribute. So if we add the state field to the color area, then color is used to distinguish the different groups, the different values in the state field. If we had added the state field to the shape area, for example, like this, then different shapes would be used to distinguish the different states, and so on. But in our example, we're going to use color, so keep the state field in the color region, and now we've got different colors used to distinguish the different states, and it's now clear that this is in fact a stacked bar chart. Okay, now we already said a few times that we want to use this radio button to allow the user to control the measure that's displayed on the y-axis. So now's the time to do that. Let's go ahead and configure the y-axis of the chart so that the value displayed here, the measure displayed here, is what the user selects from the radio button. To do this, in the chart editor, in the Y region, click the pop-up button next to the quantity field. It's the button that's marked with a down-pointing triangle, and that opens up a small menu that allows you to select how this field is going to be placed on the y-axis. The three options are by value. This allows you to specify explicitly a static field that will always be on the y-axis, which is what we've done. The variable option will allow you to use an input component to set the value of that field, and that is what we're about to do. The third option allows you to use a JavaScript expression to compute the value that will be placed, the name of the field that will be placed on the y-axis. And it's worth noting that this pop-up menu that you see here is available throughout the Visual Composer when you're designing dashboards. So you'll notice the pop-up menu again next to the X field above. And as we continue in the design of this dashboard, in many dialog boxes, you'll see again and again this small pop-up. And in every case where you see that pop-up menu, that allows you to do exactly this type of choice, to specify either a static value, to use an input component to set the value, or to use a JavaScript expression to set the value. In this case, we know that we want to use an input component to set the value, the field name that's used on the y-axis. So select the variable option, and then from the menu that appears, make sure that you have selected the measure choice input control. All right, what is the measure choice input control? Well, that is the name, that's the ID of the radio button. Recall that just a few minutes ago, we gave this radio button a particular ID, and that ID was measure choice. Because there is only one input component in this dashboard, there is only one choice in this menu. However, if we had multiple input components in the dashboard, for example, let's say that we had a radio button that specifies the choice of measure, and let's say we also had a combo box that allowed the user to select the field that's displayed on the x-axis, and perhaps another control that allows the user to choose the aggregation method. So then we'd have multiple input components, and then we really would have a choice in this menu here which input component is going to control this property. And that's why it is valuable to give a meaningful name to all of the input components so that when you see them in this list, you'll be able to choose the correct input component for the correct property. Okay, now we've made this selection so that the y-axis will be set the measure on the y-axis will be set by the radio button. Let's go ahead and test it out. If I select quantity in the radio button, you'll notice that the quantity is now placed as the measure on the y-axis of the chart, and the chart is now displaying quantity sold versus quarter. If I select total, then the chart changes to display the sum total on the y-axis, and the chart is now displaying the total dollar amount versus the quarter. Let's go ahead and see if we can move this radio button now to a more convenient location closer to the chart. What I'd like to do is actually put the radio button right over here, essentially on top of the chart in the title region. So to do that, I'm going to, first of all, put the radio button back into its elongated form so that the two options are side by side. So expand the radio button to 2-column width, and then drag up the bottom border so that the two labels are side by side. And then what we'll do is we'll drag this radio button down onto the chart. So click on the radio button and drag it down into a location towards the bottom right of the chart and drop it there. And when you do that, you'll get a prompt that asks you to select one of the following options, either move the component here or place the component into a tabbed interface. Well, the second option, placing the component into a tabbed interface, will essentially create a set of tabs. On the first tab will be the chart, and on the second tab will be the radio button. That's not the particular design that we're looking for. I just want to put the radio button on top of the chart, and so I'm going to select the first option, move component here. That simply means put the component where you dragged it to. So press the OK button, and the component is now in the location where we dragged it. However, the radio button is actually behind the chart. Because we added the chart more recently, that means that the chart was placed in front of the radio button. There is a stacking order to all the components on the dashboard. More recently added components are in front of previously added components, and so the chart is in front of the radio button. So I can correct that simply by sending the chart to the back. So just right-click on the chart and select the option towards the bottom here, Send to Back. And that will move the chart behind all of the other components. And the consequence of that is that the radio button is now visible in front of the chart. Okay, now as I look at the radio button, I think that the radio button might be improved by actually hiding the title. The title creates a bit of interference with the labels, and if that title were to be hidden, then we'd have a cleaner look to the dashboard as a whole. So let's see if we can hide that title, and you can actually do that. Just simply right-click on the radio button, select Properties, and you'll notice next to the title property there is an option to turn off the visibility. And so we can do that. If you think it looks better without the title, then simply turn off the title visibility, press OK, and now the radio button is displayed without the title. Let's again get the two labels to display side by side, and to do that I'm simply going to drag down the top border, and that will again force the labels to appear side by side with one another. And they are still functional. You can select quantity to display the quantity on the chart, select total to select the total on the chart, and you'll notice that there's much less interference with the labels on the x-axis now that we've removed the title. The next thing that we're going to do is add a flyover to the chart. A flyover is essentially a dynamic filter that allows the user to point at different groups on the chart and automatically update other components, either output components or data view components on the dashboard. In this case, what we'd like the user to be able to do is to point at a group on the chart and automatically filter the table down below to display only data from that group, and likewise filter the gauge so that the gauge only displays the aggregated total for the group that the user points at. So let's set this flyover for the chart. To do that, right-click on the chart and select Properties. In the Chart Properties dialog box, you'll notice down at the bottom there's a flyover region, and from the flyover panel we can choose what elements should be filtered by the flyover view. In this case, we want to filter both the gauge and the table. The labels shown here are the actual names of those components. Remember that every component has a name, which is essentially the ID of the component, and gauge 1 is the name of the gauge, and table view 1 is the name of the table. We could change those, of course, but there's no real reason to at this point, so let's simply enable gauge 1 and table view 1 to be the flyover views, meaning that those components will be filtered when the user moves the mouse over the chart, then press OK. To test this out, let's switch the dashboard into preview mode, even though in general the flyover view will work also in the design view. If you move the mouse over the different groups in the design view, you should be able to see the filtering in the table and in the gauge. In general, for these kinds of more interactive behaviors, it's more useful to try them out in the preview. So click the preview button in the toolbar, and that opens the dashboard for preview. This is previewing the dashboard, essentially how the user will see it. And we can try out the flyover by moving the mouse over any group in the chart. And when we do that, you'll notice that the table down below is displaying only data for the group that we are looking at. So, for example, right now I'm pointing at the fourth quarter. The x-axis has the group is the fourth quarter, and the state is New York. And if you look at the table, what you'll see is that the data in the table reflects only sales from the fourth quarter in the state of New York. If I point at some other group, for example, this one here, this is the state of Massachusetts and the first quarter of 2013. And if you look at the data in the table, you'll find only data, only sales from the first quarter 2013 in the state of Massachusetts, and so on for any other group that I point at on the chart. And the same is true for the gauge. When you point at a group on the chart, the gauge will update to display the aggregated total for just that particular group that you're pointing at. So that's the concept of a flyover. Now, if you prefer that the user click on the group in order for the flyover to take effect, that's a small property setting that you can make if you choose to do so. So return to the design view by clicking on the design view tab at the bottom, and then return to the plot properties. And you'll notice that in the flyover view panel, there's an option called on click only. If you select that option, then the flyover filtering will only occur when the user actually clicks a group on the chart rather than simply hovering over the group. So you can make a decision whether or not you prefer the user to have to click on the group. I will leave it as a hover filter so that the user only has to hover to implement the filtering, and I'll leave it that way. So now that we're finished with the chart, we can begin adding decorative components to this dashboard. So let's begin by adding a gradient background. And to do that, we'll use an image component. So scroll down in the toolbox and find the image component. It's in the output folder. So grab an image component and drag that into the dashboard. And that gives us a blank image. You'll note that we can resize this image. So let's go ahead and do that. Resize the image. And what we'd like to do is create an image that is large enough to go behind all of the components on the dashboard. So let's just drag the handle, and we'll make this larger, larger, larger until the image is large enough to go behind everything, like this. Now, I do know that the image is actually in front of the other components. We'll correct that in a moment, but let's just get the size right. Something like this. We'll leave a little bit of room for a title up at the top here. So now we have an image, and let's go ahead and move this image component to the back so that it's behind all of the other components. Right-click on the image and select Send to Back, and now the image is at the back. Now, currently this image is not actually displaying an image, it's just an empty container, so let's correct that and actually select an image to be displayed. So right-click on the image component. You'll have to click on it in an area where it's not being obscured by one of the other components. So just click on it, right-click in an empty area, and then select Properties. And from here, we can select the particular image that's being displayed in the image component. If you have an image in general on your local system that you want to upload for use, you would press the Upload button, and that would open a file browser from which you could then select the particular image that you want the image component to display. But in our case, we're going to select one of the skins. These are preset images that are useful for backgrounds. So let's select the background 1 image. You'll notice that it's basically just a gradient. And let's see what the result of this is if I just leave the other settings as they are. Press OK. And what you'll notice is that that does then insert the image into the image component, but the image is quite small. Right? So this image is nowhere near large enough to provide a background for all of the components. And the reason for that is that by default, scaling is turned off. So if we want this image that we've selected to expand so that it provides a background for all of the components on the dashboard, then we're going to need to change the scaling property. So right-click again on the image component and select Properties, and then go to the Advanced tab. Under the Advanced tab, you'll notice that there are two different kinds of scaling. We can turn on the Scale Image property. So now image scaling is on, but we do have a choice. One choice is Maintain Aspect Ratio, and the other choice is Scale 9-Cell Grid. Now, the most common kind of scaling is Maintain Aspect Ratio, which means that the proportions of the image will be maintained. However, in this case, what we'll find out is that this doesn't work quite well. So let's try this and see what happens. So select Maintain Aspect Ratio, press OK. And the image then does scale. However, there are two problems. The first problem is that the image maintains its proportions. It's a square image, and yet the area that we want to fill is rectangular. So somehow we'd like this image to actually be able to scale and fill the rectangular area that we need filled behind the dashboard components. So problem number one is that the scaling is proportional, and in this case we don't want that. Problem number two is that the border of the image, there was a 1 pixel border around the gradient. The border of the image has scaled together with the image. So the border, which was originally a 1 pixel gray border, is now many times larger, perhaps a 30 pixel wide border, and that doesn't look very good. We really just want a gradient background. We don't want the border to be so prominent. So to correct these problems, what we'll do is we'll return to the Properties dialog box by right-clicking and selecting Properties, and we'll use the alternative scaling method, and that is the 9-cell grid scaling. And that's perfect for this case, because when you select 9-cell grid, what it allows you to do is to select a certain region at the top, left, bottom, and right of the image to which the scaling will not be applied. And the reason I say that's perfect is because right here we have a case of an image that has a border that we do not wish to scale. The 1 pixel wide gray border should remain 1 pixel wide when the image is scaled, and it's only the interior of the image, the gradient part of the image, that I'd like to scale. So to make that happen, because I know that the gray border is in fact 1 pixel, what I can do is simply enter 1 for the top, bottom, left, and right. And again, this means that the 1 pixel at the top of the image will not be scaled. The 1 pixel region at the bottom of the image will not be scaled, and so too for the left and right sides of the image, and only the interior of the image will be scaled. The reason this is called 9-cell grid is that if you draw a picture of how this scaling is being applied, it turns out that the image is actually divided into a 9-cell grid. You can take a look at the pictures in the documentation to help convince you of that. But hopefully this is enough to give you the idea of how this scaling works. Let's press OK. And now this image has been scaled to fit the component dimensions. Right, the image component is a rectangular, has rectangular dimensions. The image fills that completely, and the 1 pixel border all around remains 1 pixel, even after the scaling. Okay, let's go ahead now and add some text to this dashboard. We'd like a title up at the top, and we'll also put some text under the gauge to help users understand that this gauge is displaying the total dollar amount in thousands. So we'll begin with the title at the top. Now, there are a couple different ways to add text to a dashboard. One way is to find the text component. It's in the output folder, and just drag that text component into the dashboard wherever you want it to go. If you drag it on top of another component, as I just did, then you'll get some options, such as move component here, move component right, down, and place into tabbed interface. As always, when you want the component to be placed where you dragged it, select the Move Component Here option, which is the first one, and press OK. And now we've got a text element on the dashboard. So the first thing to do is to edit the text. You can do that by double-clicking in the text element to select the dummy text that's there. And we'll simply type Order Data Dashboard as the very generic title of this dashboard. You can resize the text element by dragging the handles, as you can do with any component. And so resize the text element. I'll actually drag the text element to be the full width of the dashboard. You'll notice that when you drag and resize a component, or when you move a component, as you're dragging, when that component aligns with the edge of other components, you'll see a green line indicating that you've achieved alignment. So that's helpful when you're resizing components or moving components. You can look for those lines as they pop up. So here I've dragged the right side of the text component until it gets to the right side of the selection lists. That basically spans then the full width of the dashboard. Okay, let's make the text a little bit bigger and bolder, and that's easy to do from the toolbar. You can also do it from the Format dialog box, so you can right-click on the text element, select Format, and that certainly gives you the ability to style the color and the font and the border and so on. But this is easier to do from the toolbar, so let's make this 18-point text, because this is the big header, so we'd like it to be big, and we'll make it bold by pressing the bold button in the toolbar, and also center aligned. So there's our title. Let's go ahead and add another text component, this time below the gauge, that will say total dollars in thousands. And we can illustrate the other method of adding a text element. We already saw that you can drag the element from the toolbox. As it turns out, you can also double-click in any empty cell on the dashboard grid to add a text element. So I don't want to double-click on any of the existing components, because that will then select that component. But if I can find an empty space, down here I have some empty spaces. If I double-click in any of those empty cells, that will automatically create a text element in that location. So I've just double-clicked, created a text element, and as the contents of this text element, I'll type total, and then a $sign, and then in parentheses, thousands. And the purpose of this is so that I'm going to put this below the gauge, so the user will understand that when they look at these numbers, they basically need to multiply those values by 1,000 in order to get the actual dollar amount. So let's center this text, and then we can move it below the gauge. I might move the gauge up just a little bit to make some room, and I'll do that by nudging it with the arrow keys on the keyboard while holding down the Control key to move it in small increments, and then drag the text element below it. And when you're prompted what you want to do with the text element, select Move Component here, and then I'll just try to align that again by nudging it with Control arrow movements so that it looks something like this. And so now we have a label below the gauge. Let's go ahead and make this dashboard look just a bit nicer by putting some backgrounds behind the selection elements and behind the table and the chart. And we can do that using white rectangles. So it'll just give a better sense of grouping to the dashboard if we add some additional backgrounds. Of course, you can be the judge for yourself about the aesthetics of the dashboard. But I'll try to make it look a little bit better with a couple of rectangles. So under the shape folder in our toolbox, find the rectangle component and drag in a rectangle wherever you can find a space. I'll just drop it up here. And we want this rectangle to basically cover the chart and the table. And so eventually we're going to have to move this back in the stacking order. But for now, let's just see if we can get the size right, and we can always readjust the size later. We want it to be just a bit bigger than the table and the chart. And of course, since the rectangle is the most recent component we've added, right now it's in front of the table and chart, but I can fix that by selecting, by right-clicking on the rectangle and selecting Send to Back. Okay. Now that sends the rectangle all the way to the back, even behind the image, so if I want the rectangle in front of the image, which I do, then I need to right-click. Let me do it here so you can see the menu. Right-click on the image. I'm trying to avoid clicking on other components, so trying to find a region of the image where I can right-click and make sure that I select the image. And when I do that, then for the image, select Send to Back. And now the image is, again, all the way at the back, and you can see the white rectangle. Now I'm just going to resize this rectangle so that it's just a bit bigger than the table and the chart, and provides a nice background for them. Try to make it the same width on all sides as best as I can. And if I need to, I will readjust the size of the image also, if I need a little bit more space. Okay. Now let's say that I want this white rectangle to have rounded borders. That's easy enough to do. Right-click on the rectangle. Again, it's important to avoid right-clicking on the components. We've left ourselves relatively little space, so you'll have to be careful where you click so that you select the rectangle rather than the chart or the table, but it can be done. So right-click on the rectangle and then select Properties. And from the Shape tab of the Rectangle Properties dialog box, there's an option here to round the corner. So let's switch this corner rounding from 0, which means a sharp corner, to 12 pixels. So that's a moderately rounded corner. The setting here, the value that you set, is the radius of the corner, meaning that if you think of the corner of a rectangle as part of a circle, this would be the radius of that circle. So larger numbers mean larger circle, meaning more gently rounded corner. Smaller numbers mean smaller circle, smaller radius, which means sharper corner. So larger numbers are a more gradual curve. So 12 is kind of a moderate setting. Press OK. And if you take a look now, you'll notice that the rectangle has rounded edges. And again, you can adjust that number to suit your own taste. Let's go ahead and add another rectangle behind the selection components, again to create a grouping effect, a visual grouping effect to make the dashboard look a little bit more appealing to the user. We can repeat the process that we did before to drag a new rectangle component, but since we already have one here, we might as well just copy the existing rectangle. There are various ways to do this. You can press Control-C and Control-V on the keyboard. You can hold down the Control key and drag on the rectangle to make a copy, and that's true for any other component as well. Or you can right-click, select Copy, and then in an empty region of the dashboard, right-click and select Paste, and that will give you a copy of the rectangle. All of these techniques work for other components as well, not only for rectangles, but you can, in general, copy and paste dashboard components using any of those techniques. So now we've got another rectangle, and I'm going to position it behind, or rather position it so that it overlaps the selection components. And then I'm going to move it to the back like we did before, right-click on the component and select Send to Back. So now this rectangle is behind everything, not only behind the selection components, but also behind the background image. So again, I have to correct that by right-clicking on the image. Again, make sure you click on the image and not on one of the other components. And when you've clicked on the image will be selected and send the image to the back again. So now that rectangle is visible. And now I'm just going to position this rectangle so that the bottom of the rectangle aligns with the bottom of the other rectangle. So I'm just going to drag the rectangle up until I see the green highlight indicating alignment. And then I'll just make some other small adjustments. I'll worry about adjusting the selection components in just a moment, but before we do that, we have a bit of space here, a bit more space than we need between the chart and the selection components. And so my first thought might be to move these selection components over to the left to tighten up the dashboard a little bit. But if you do that, you'll notice that then the selection component would be too close. So the selection list, if I either drag it or move it by pressing the keyboard keys, move it to the left, then it's going to be butting right up against the chart. So it seems that we're in a situation here where either the selection components are too far or too close. And the way that you can address that is by changing the width of the grid. Right? So what we'll do is we'll go up to the grid header all the way up at the top here. And rather than moving the component, what I'm going to do is resize the grid. So I can make the grid column a little bit more narrow, and that will have the effect of moving all the components that are in that grid column a little bit to the left, and then I can adjust the rectangle a bit more based on that new position so that I have the grouping that I'm looking for. So this is something to keep in mind. When you're positioning components, you have to be aware that some components can be freely positioned, such as the chart, such as the gauge, such as text elements. Those components can be moved completely freely on the dashboard grid. They're not tied to the grid columns or rows, whereas other components, such as selection lists and tables, are in fact locked to the grid. So when you're dealing with those components to get the precise positioning that you want, you may have to, in fact, modify the spacing of the grid like we just did. Okay, well, I'm going to move up these selection components because I want the range slider to have a little bit more space at the bottom. And again, I'll nudge the range slider up just by using the control arrow keys. And then I can move the gauge here and move the text element, again, so that things are nicely aligned. Really, I should align this a little bit better. Okay, and then I can adjust, since we've removed some of the unnecessary space there, I can adjust the size of the image to be a bit more suitable. And finally, I'll also change the positioning of the header here, just make this a little bit narrower so that the header, the title of the dashboard, is nicely centered over the components on the dashboard. So now we're basically finished with this dashboard. We've implemented all of the functionality, the chart, the table, the flyover, the selection components, the gauge, and we've added some nice aesthetic treatments, an image in the background, some shape components, these rectangles to provide a little bit of visual grouping for the user. So let's go ahead and preview this by pressing the preview button and then verify that everything works as expected. So now we're looking at the previewed dashboard. This is pretty much exactly the way the user will see it when they open the dashboard in the portal. So let's verify that all of the functionality works. I can select particular groups of companies, and I'll see the sales for the particular companies that I've selected listed in the table, and I'll see the aggregated totals for the companies that I've selected displayed on the gauge. Likewise, I can select particular groups of states. So for example, I can select the state of Maryland, in which case I'm going to see only data for Maryland in the table and in the chart, and I can add additional states and so on. So the selection controls are functional. I can restrict the data to a particular set of dates by using the range slider at the bottom. Additionally, I have a flyover on the chart, so if I want to narrow the data in the table to just a particular group, what I can do is fly over that group on the chart, and I'll observe that the table updates to display only data for that particular group. So that is the basic functionality of this dashboard, and it should give you a pretty good idea of a variety of the things you can do when you're building dashboards. So let's return to the design view and save our work by pressing the Save button. And now we can go ahead and open up the portal and view this dashboard in the portal. So return to the user portal, and we'll take a look at the Report tab. So when we save a dashboard, we expect it to appear under the Report tab. And you can see that the repository listing on the left now does in fact contain the dashboard that we saved. If you want to save a dashboard under the Dashboard tab, that requires a further step of deploying the dashboard to the Dashboard tab. We cover that in a different video. But when you simply save a dashboard into the repository, it appears in the repository listing under the Report tab. And so you can click on that dashboard now, and that will open the dashboard in the portal. And so this is the way a user will experience the dashboard. They can open the dashboard from the repository, and then the dashboard is fully functional. The flyovers, the selection components, the ability to change between quantity and total as the measure, and so on. Now, one thing that you'll note, and you can try this on your own browser, is that if you resize the browser, the dashboard will remain effectively the same size. So the dashboard design is essentially static in the sense that it does not readjust to the size of the browser window. It remains the size at which you designed the dashboard. Now, in some cases, especially if you expect the dashboard to be viewed on different devices, such as PCs and tablets and perhaps phones, you may want the dashboard to dynamically size itself to the screen. And that's something that we can arrange by making a particular setting back in the Visual Composer. So let's return to the Visual Composer, and let's press the Options button at the top. That opens the View Sheet Options dialog box. There's a number of different settings that you can make here, but the particular setting that we're interested in right now is the Scale to Screen option. And by selecting the Scale to Screen option, what we'll do is allow the dashboard that we've created to dynamically size to the screen on which it's being displayed. So we'll turn on the Scale to Screen option, press OK. You won't see any change in the design view. The design view remains the same, but if you preview the dashboard or view the dashboard in the portal, then you'll find that as the screen size is changed, the dashboard will change along with the screen size. And what we should do when we use this setting is we should also try to position the dashboard as much as possible towards the upper left corner. So what I'll do here is I'm going to simply remove a couple of rows, and I could move all of the components in the dashboard upward. In other words, I could select all of the components by dragging across them and then move them all simultaneously upward. However, because different components move differently, some components move freely and some components move in increments of the grid, my preference is not to do that because I've got the layout just the way I want it. So instead, I'm just going to remove some of the rows here by right-clicking on the row, the grid row, and select Delete Row. And that moves the dashboard up enough, and I'm satisfied now that the dashboard is that we've created is close enough to the top left corner that it will look good in the portal. So our dashboard design is now completed. Let's make sure we save it again. And again, we can return to the portal, and we'll reload the dashboard just by clicking on the dashboard name again. And when the dashboard reloads this time, you might notice that it's now sized a little bit better to the available space in the portal panel. Now it's difficult for me to demonstrate this because of the way the screen capture works. But if on your own computer, if you resize the browser window, what you'll find is that the dashboard that you've designed now moves fluidly along with the size of the browser window. So as the browser gets bigger, the dashboard gets bigger. As the browser gets smaller, the dashboard gets smaller, and so on. And that makes the dashboard much more flexible for use on different devices, such as I mentioned before, tablets or smaller computers. So that brings us to the end of the dashboard design.